You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Good evening. I'm Kiki Latimer. I'm guest hosting WCAT Radio's Author to Author. And this evening we have Stephen Beach with us, who is the author of a new book, The Drama of Metaphysics, a philosophical exploration into the psychological power of worldviews. So that's quite a title.
Thank you, Kiki, for having me.
Thank you. Would you mind starting us with a quick prayer?
Sure, no problem. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for this opportunity to discuss, to learn, to pray together. We pray that you would give us your Holy Spirit and help us to be better evangelists for your kingdom. Amen.
Amen.
Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background? I know you've sent me some of it, but I thought I'd just let you run through it briefly.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm from South Carolina, and after high school, I was interested in the priesthood. So I spent like 4 to 5 years just learning the priesthood and 4 years in seminary. So for undergraduate, I studied at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. There I did like philosophical theology, so kind of a mix of both like Thomistic philosophy and theology. And then after that, I went for my master's in theology in Houston at the University of St. Thomas. And then at that point, I had left the seminary and got into teaching. And so for the last 9 years, I've been teaching, working with high schoolers, religion, theology, philosophy at the Catholic school here. And then the last, 2.5 years, I went back to school at Holy Apostles and finished the master's in philosophy, which this book is the result of. So there's that. And then I also, for the last 1.5 years, I've been running a blog, The Great Perennial Questions, and just blogging about the history of philosophy, basically.
That's awesome. Did you do the courses with Holy Apostles online, or were you on campus at all?
I did, yeah. I did it all from here in Charleston.
Yeah. I work on campus, but I did my courses there also online.
Okay.
It worked out pretty well. Yeah, I had 4 years to do it in, and it was fun.
Yeah, it's a great program. The only regret is not being able to meet people like you face to face, but other than that, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah,
it worked out well. It's a good program.
Definitely.
Yeah. So let's take a look at this whole concept of worldview, which is, I've read the book recently and rather quickly, loved it. First of all, I want to say I love your writing style. It's very easy to read. I didn't get the impression that you need a lot of philosophical background to understand the concepts that you present, which I think is great, that your average layperson could read the book and get the ideas.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's been one of my goals, is to try to write something that I felt was like meaningful and that people could engage with, and that wouldn't necessarily just be specifically for academics. So,
well, I think you did it.
Thank you.
Good job. I think that worked. So tell us about the concept of a worldview.
Yeah, so I guess I would start by introducing a problem that I kept running into, and I'd call it the problem of incomplete information. So for years, as I've been teaching, one of the courses that I do is a Catholic morality course to 11th graders. And for the first few years, I kept getting stumped, like, okay, I would say X, Y, and Z, but then some kids would hear the opposite of X, Y, and Z. And I kept wondering, why do some kids take it one way? Why do some kids take it a different, opposite way of what I said? I'm just saying what I'm saying, right? So that kind of had me puzzled for a while. And then also I ran into the same problem. A few years ago, I got involved with the Discovery Institute in Seattle. And I wanted to learn more about evolution and intelligent design. And that same interpretation problem came back, because you have materialist scientists over here and then intelligent design scientists here. And you have the same set of data in the middle, but then they're taking it to two different conclusions. So, like, how could that be? So then that kind of got me thinking like, okay, this problem of incomplete information, it's like, I know point A, or let's say point 1, and I know point 10, all right, but there's a whole space 2 through 9 in the middle that I don't know. But as a human, I want to try to connect those dots and kind of form a larger picture of the thing. So I have to kind of supply 2 through 9 as like a set of beliefs, which gets me from point 1 to point 10. And so then it kind of made sense to me. This is like our worldview, our most basic beliefs, which are about big questions, which we don't have all the answers yet. We have to give some, I guess, preliminary answer so we can make it from point 1 to point 10. Otherwise, reality just doesn't quite make sense.
Okay. Right. So it's interesting you mentioned that you had these two groups of scientists, the complete materialist and intelligent design.
Yeah.
And that, at some point they can work together. But then at some point you clearly veer off. My husband's a scientist, so he deals with that all the time. He believes in intelligent design, but he works with a lot of people who don't hold that worldview at all, until somebody's sick in their family, and then they come and ask him to pray.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's what's, I think, so fundamental here is we want a picture of our history, where we've come from. We want to have a picture of our identity, who we are, and then the future, where we should go. And so when we don't have that information, we try to supply it from somewhere else. And so like with the scientists, it's like, okay, you have this set of data, all right, but you have to tell a story with that data, right? Where do we come from? Is it evolution? Is it creation? Who are we? Are we like evolved chimps, or do we have a soul? And then where are we going? Is this life all that there is, or is there an afterlife? So worldview is really filling in those gaps on those big questions.
There's a wonderful joke that I always like about the scientist who goes to God and says, if I had enough time, if I had all the time in the world, billions of years, I could create all of this just by time through evolution. And God says, all right, I'll take you up on the bet. I'll give you several billion years, go for it. And the scientist says, great. And he reaches down for some dirt to start the whole thing with. And God says, no, you get your own stuff.
Yeah. It's not so easy starting from nothing.
Right, starting from nothing, and science, of course, starts from something.
Exactly,
It's nature, it starts from something. I mean, even if you have the Big Bang, you're starting from something.
But if you're not aware that when you read their articles or you see it on the news, that there's an assumption at the basis of their conclusions, then you just begin to take it as fact rather than, hey, they're filling in this whole thing of where things came from with their own set of beliefs.
Correct. Yeah. I remember somebody said they didn't have that much faith to be an atheist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of assumptions there. Mm-hmm. You talk about the idea in the book that I've found fascinating about that in the past, the idea was that we have a nature. And now this idea that we are nature. Yeah. That we create our own nature. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
I mean, we choose gender now. We're living in this society that's like gone way over to not only, sort of determining what kind of a person I want to be, to determining what I am and even my gender.
And something like that comes out of the worldview of materialism. And so that's why I entitled it The Drama of Metaphysics, because, and I got this from Jose Ortega y Gasset, which I talk a lot about in the book. But like the history of philosophy, it's this continual conversation around a central question, like what is reality? Because we're always faced with this like dichotomy. Things are always changing around us in like a physical sense. But at the same time, like our mind, we see like whole essences or whole identities. And I think Plato is like the master of this, right? The physical changing world, but then the mind sees these eternal forms in the physical. And so it kind of hit me like all these different schools of philosophy, they're really wrestling with that same mystery. Like, what is reality? Is there a deeper identity in things which isn't just physical? And so, yeah, go like with the gender thing, if you don't see, or if you don't believe that there's a deeper soul, for example, we're just a body, well, then you're not locked into any sort of boundaries as to what a human is. And so that's part of transhumanism is, can we use technology to reshape those boundaries, to reshape man, to reshape gender, to reshape birth, all the family, all those things. But it's based in that assumption that, hey, we're just matter. There's no deeper essence to us.
Well, I've always been fascinated. I sent it to you by Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's statement after Roe v. Wade that said, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life.
Yeah, what a statement, right?
Statement from the Supreme Court Justice. At the heart of liberty is this right to define
oh my goodness,
everything. You know?
Yeah, if only we could do that. And that's kind of where the drama comes in. And I've read a lot about Dostoevsky in this because he could see this coming in the late 1800s. And then into the 1900s, the question becomes, can we do exactly what he said? Can we shape reality the way we want it? Or is that going to turn out badly? It's going to be impossible. So that's really kind of at the heart of these different ideologies that I talk about.
It seems if we do have a nature, that if you start to have an ideology that goes against that nature, it's going to run into problems.
Yeah. And for me, because one of the questions I had was, how did these atrocities in the 20th century happen? You know, you have genocide, concentration camps, millions of people murdered in the name of these ideas. Like, how do you get there? And I think that's exactly what you're saying, right? You have an idea that doesn't match with human nature, and so you have to almost force it on people.
Right. At one point, let's see if I can find it here in the notes, you quoted the idea of, I think it was from Dostoevsky, the idea of having that your right to life, that your right to live, it's something you have to deserve. And if somebody doesn't deserve to live, then you can get rid of them.
Right. Yeah.
So obviously in Nazi Germany, you know, a Jew didn't quote unquote deserve to live because for whatever reason. And so you start to define the terms by which someone that their life has value.
Yeah, exactly. And those materialist ideologies, they don't really believe in an individual, more a collective. So you don't have a nature, like you said, you are nature. And so Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment, writing this very interesting passage where these group of students are sitting around talking about this old pawnbroker who they do not like at all. They think she's a horrible person. And then he kind of connects one of them into this sort of Darwinian idea that, hey, nature, since we are nature, is only going to progress when we get rid of these type of people. And so just like you squash a bug, somebody needs to just squash her and everybody will be, you know, for the better.
Right. Yeah, as long as it's not me, right?
Right.
Survival of the fittest, as long as it's not me. Right. It's a very interesting thing. You know, after Roe v. Wade with the abortion question, Marianne Warren came up with a list of 5 things that sort of defined a person. And if you didn't have those 5 things, one was, consciousness, wanting to continue your existence. But a lot of it had also to do with being welcomed by the community. So if you weren't welcomed by the community, then you really didn't have a right to live in the community. So if the fetus wasn't welcomed by the community, oh well. If the Jew isn't welcomed by the German community, whatever characteristics you decide this person does or doesn't have, then that's how you determine whether they deserve to live.
Yeah. And when you base, someone's worth and criteria like that, you're always going to end up excluding a large group of people because our physical characteristics aren't universal, right, like our soul would be. So, wow, yeah, that's kind of scary.
So you talk about here the danger of worldview manipulation. Talk about that a little.
Yeah, so I discovered the work of Hannah Arendt, a 20th century philosopher, and I found it so interesting because thinking about the 20th century, Nazi Germany, communist Russia, okay, she says they weren't exactly like dictatorships, that they're actually a new form of government that hadn't really manifested itself in human history yet. And the difference was dictatorships are solely an exterior coercion of people. But she was talking about totalitarianism as something that goes within the mind and colonizes the mind of the person, possessing them from within. So not only you control them from without, but you can control people from within. And the way that that's done is by tinkering and manipulating with people's worldviews or their belief systems. Okay, so if your origin, your identity, and your purpose is tied up in your beliefs, okay, what if I change those beliefs around, make them something totally different? Then you have a new conception of yourself, a new conception of what you're supposed to be doing, new conception of other people. And that seems like such a temptation to power. Obviously, if you want to create a new view of humanity, hey, what if we reshape our whole thoughts on everything?
I mean, we've certainly seen these massive changes in the last 50 years. I'm sure worldwide, but especially in the American culture, from the questioning of authority to the questioning, does God exist? To it not even almost in many circles now, it's not even a question. It's right. Just a given that God doesn't exist. And that things that in the past, the concepts of morality that were sort of set in stone for centuries, millennia, have just been completely at least set aside, if not thrown out completely, but it's certainly set aside very easily.
Yeah, and I would say it's still happening. Like in the early 20th century, they tried to do it very suddenly with force and all at once. And of course, we got these horrors, which I think people kind of recoiled from for a while. But now ideologies like communism, they're becoming popular again. But it's doing it in kind of a more subtle way. It hasn't obviously reached the point of genocide and things like that. But I think it's happening. If you teach somebody from when they're little to think a certain way and you don't ever present them any other sets of facts, then you can kind of brainwash somebody into changing their worldview. Yeah.
Well, we see it. My husband and I notice it quite a bit with TV programs. I mean, we watch a lot of Netflix and Hulu and sort of streaming shows. And there's clearly a worldview being presented, a worldview of what marriage is, sexuality, all kinds of things connected to sexuality. And it's just there now as background. It's just there very subtly, but as a norm, that marriage is not the norm, that monogamy is not the norm, that sex connected to love in any way is not the norm. Right. So it's very interesting. It's sort of like the frog that you put into the cold water and you slowly raise the temperature. He doesn't jump out.
Yeah.
So we don't jump out anymore when we see these things that go against, Judeo-Christian values for, centuries. We're not surprised by it. That doesn't even faze us all that much anymore. It's very interesting.
Right. Yeah. And that was one of the things that I wanted to make people aware of is the influence of technology. It's getting more and more invasive into our lives, and especially to the lives of our children, where they're growing up from when they're little with ideas that are coming to them through social media, through TikTok, through Instagram, through Snapchat, and their parents don't necessarily know what those ideas are, right? And so, yeah, their whole mind can be shaped through, because the technology is in their room, it's in their hand. It's like the world is reaching into someone's house and teaching their children, which has never happened before. But it seems like it's only going to continue. I mean, the stuff with virtual reality that's coming out, the way that people receive information, all of it's through technology, right? Through media. So that can be manipulated. People's experience of reality is being more and more controlled, I think, by this technology.
Mm. Yeah. The idea that, I mean, it's almost impossible, I'm thinking, for parents to keep up with the technology. My father was born in 1906, so I know he had trouble keeping up with the technology that, I was growing up with, and the same with my children and now the grandchildren. I mean, they're on social media a lot. So you're almost getting your worldview from a collective at this point, very differently than in the past.
Which is kind of supplanting the role of parents, which I think is a big deal.
Right. Okay. So I'll check. Oh, yes, the idea of truth. That came up quite a bit. And you mentioned Nietzsche in the Western society. This valuing of the idea of truth. You want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, Pilate's question, what is truth?
Right.
What is truth? What is truth?
So
I love to find it here. Oh, yes, you mentioned here philosophy is the conformity of man's mind with eternal truths.
Right.
So what is truth?
So I would say, for most of Western history up until the 19th century, truth is very much connected to the idea of identity. Okay, so like Plato's forms, all right, you can have many, let's say, tables all around us, different shapes, different sizes. But for Plato, there's a universal form of table that all of those individual tables have to conform to. So what you do is you take the physical and you abstract the essence, and now you have it in the logical realm. And then when you have it in the logical realm, you can begin to interact with reality on a logical level. So then you have, like, for example, the different stages of reasoning: conceptualization, judgment, reasoning. And so truth for so many centuries was kind of exactly that, the unchanging identity that resides in things, the things in themselves, or the essences of things. But then there's the big change. Once you reject the idea that there are these identities in things or immaterial essences, well, then kind of everything's up for grabs. And Nietzsche is so interesting. He makes the claim that this idea of logical truth is simply a value judgment, as if you could accept it or not accept it. And Western society has chosen to value these metaphysical essences, but you know what? Maybe we don't need to. Maybe we could value the opposite. And so he talks about embracing the passions, embracing the will, embracing power as equal alternatives with this idea of truth.
It's interesting. We talk about it in our Understanding Abortion book that I co-authored, the idea of, this idea of creating truth.
Yeah.
If you were to, when you work with your high school students, what kind of example would you give? Like if they said to you, well, how do I do this? Where do I do this? Give me an example of, I think a chair is a chair and a table is a table. So give me an example of how you would explain to a teenager where they do this, how they do this.
For sure. So even you mentioned abortion. That's a perfect example. Right. So I could put up on the screen a picture of an embryo, let's say. Now, if you're a materialist, you look at that and you see, hey, that's just a cell, or that's just a clump of cells. Like it's nothing. Like just, stamp it out. Who cares? So if that's the way you approach it, you end up seeing that. But now, if you approach it from a theistic perspective, okay, you have the physical embryo, but there's also a metaphysical identity of a human person there present. And so that's why John Paul talks about respecting life, even from that first moment, as having full human rights. So when people debate in society, you'll see maybe they're debating up here. Hey, it's a clump of cells. No, this, that. But actually, the debate really is kind of like the iceberg. It's really down here. How do we conceive of the identity of things? Or is there a metaphysical identity or not, I guess? Yeah. Is that
okay? Yeah.
An example?
Yeah. Years ago, I had an interesting situation. I was talking with a confirmation class, a Catholic confirmation class, and they were insisting that a woman had a right to an abortion. And they had all of those worldview sort of slogans that went with that idea. And so for 2 hours, I tried to convince them that, it was a valuable life, that this was a child. But they said, no, a woman had a right to her body. And I got that whole worldview was just continuously thrown at me. So I finally gave up and I said, I'm getting out of here, And, but just before I left, I handed out what's called the Life or Death brochure, which shows what an abortion actually is. It's very graphic. And there was just complete silence in the room of these 15 teenagers. And then and just silence. They'd been yelling at me for 2 hours, gosh. And now there was silence because this change was changing their worldview. It was very interesting.
Right, confronting reality face to face.
Yeah, like the truth was they couldn't get away from it. And finally, one girl said very quietly, but in a whisper, "No one should do this to a baby." And they all agreed with her. It was very interesting. That being confronted by truth, the inescapable truth, their worldview changed right before my eyes. And it was fascinating to see that.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because that's a theme in Arendt's work, is that ideologies, if they reject the idea of an individual's experience, can corrupt somebody's mind so much that you can present them with all these arguments and facts and information, and they can't see that white is white and black is black, because all they can do is apply the premises of the ideology to the individual experience. So to break through that is extremely difficult, like you were saying. And I was thinking earlier today of that video called The Silent Screen, I think, where they filmed an abortion, and just thinking about that, I mean, that should wake you up. I mean, it's unimaginable.
We thought it would wake people up, but it didn't. It's very interesting. Yeah. Sometimes, that concept, going back to, truth is very connected, obviously, to morality, and that there's concepts of good and evil. And it comes up certainly in my metaphysics classes with teenagers, which I try to avoid teaching teenagers. God bless you. But the idea of who decides what is right and wrong? That question: who decides?
Right.
And the concept that no one should be deciding what's right and wrong. Right and wrong is something that we discover. Something is good in and of itself, or evil in and of itself. And I explained to them that even God doesn't decide what's good and evil. I think God says beauty is good because beauty is good. Yeah. Rather than the other way around. And I actually had a Protestant friend that I had a discussion with many years ago who believed the opposite of that. And his idea was that rape, the example we used at the time was rape. Rape is wrong because God says it's wrong. See, then you run into the problem. Well, what if God decides to say it's good? And he actually said to me, then if God said rape was good, then rape would be good. That's fascinating, because it was like God decides what is good and evil, but God is good. It's in his nature. His nature is goodness. So he doesn't even get to decide his own nature. He is goodness.
Right.
So we discover truth rather than creating it. Once you get into a situation where we decide what is good and what is evil, which is basically what is happening in a materialistic worldview, then you've got a huge problem.
Yeah, and that's why Nietzsche entitles one of his works Beyond Good and Evil, because if you relegate objective truth to just a value, hey, I could take it or not take it, then all you're really left with is power. And so you see that a lot today, discussion about power, because if there's no truth, well, power is just, can I get you to think this? Can I manipulate you to think this? And if I can, then I've won, instead of saying, is this true? Is it corresponding with reality? So yeah, it becomes kind of like a power game rather than like a revelation of sorts.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting. It's fascinating. You did a really good job in the book of bringing us sort of down that road of how we got from point A to point B, how we went from like a Judeo-Christian, Christocentric worldview where there was clear delineations of good and evil, that, we have a nature, to where we are today.
Yeah, and that was also kind of at the end. I wanted to kind of go back to that, is as Christians, it's like our worldview and the materialist worldview, we're only going further and further apart because technology is enabling us to do things we could never do in the past. And so how do we live in a society when our worldviews are so utterly different from one another? We have to find some type of common ground, but it's getting harder and harder to do that.
Science is, in a sense, the God at the moment of the culture. If something is researched and science says it's true, then it's true. I found this very interesting during COVID time, during the pandemic, because it was like a small group of people, the scientists were deciding everything for the society. Everything was being decided.
Right.
And all the power was there. And if they were wrong, well, they were the science. That was the science. Everything revolved around that. Those decisions.
And I talk about John Dewey in the book, which is kind of the embodiment of what you're talking about. So he saw what Darwin did as kind of cutting the philosophical past away and allowing science to replace all disciplines. And so if you have that materialist worldview, well, then you can apply the scientific method to something like how human society should function, or complex value systems, or should you take this vaccine or not take this vaccine? Whereas traditionally, and I think in reality, those are questions that you can't answer just with a scientific perspective. You have to bring in that moral, that narrative, that philosophical, religious perspective also.
We had people dying alone in hospital rooms. And I in particular had a friend who's, she was dying in the hospital and her husband was out in the car and couldn't be let in. I always wondered, and there didn't seem to be any sense of, well, we should just wheel her out. She's dying anyway.
Right.
But they didn't want him to get COVID, and I guess they didn't want her to die of COVID.
Oh my gosh.
They kept them apart. So it was all just, this is the science. The science has decided, and so she will die alone and he will sit in the car in the parking lot while she dies. Right. And any kind of metaphysical understanding of the human person, the rights of marriage, the rights of two people who love each other, to not die alone,
right?
Unnecessary. That wasn't part of the equation at all. It was just the science of COVID. She wasn't dying of COVID. She was dying of something else.
Okay.
So it wasn't even COVID connected. It was just that he couldn't go in, and there was nothing set in place for them to bring her out, because that personal dimension, the value of the human life and human relationships, wasn't part of the science.
Right.
You know?
Right. And that's the same problem Dewey has. The only value system Dewey can create has to do with your bodily health, which is kind of what you're saying. But there's more, it's worth it to take a risk of bodily health, for other more important values, such as seeing your dying spouse, for example,
Right.
or
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, you would think.
You would think, yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely the worldview has consequences in reality, in human life. We live out those consequences. Whether if the worldview is wrong that a particular group has, or a society, or the whole world has, then we live out those consequences with terrible consequences.
Right. Yeah. And that's why, Young, Jordan Peterson, Gasset, all these people Arendt talk about that you don't necessarily have ideas. Ideas have you. Like, you're the manifestation of these worldview ideas. And so if you get them wrong, and that manifests itself through society, you're gonna reap the consequences down to the smallest level.
Yeah. It's interesting, what we believe becomes what we do.
Exactly.
Action comes from our beliefs. And rightly so, we have to act on what we believe. I mean, the conscience doesn't know right from wrong all by itself. So the conscience gets informed. And we're required to act on that conscience, even if it's in error. So, and most people do, to some extent, act as their conscience tells them to. But when the conscience has been formed improperly, then you're kind of stuck with those beliefs that will become your actions. Yeah. Right.
And as Catholics, we know this, right? Lex orandi, lex credendi, like liturgy and belief are tied together. So this has always kind of been implicit with us, but sometimes, we don't always make the connection to regular society, and the political systems and beliefs that are going around in the culture.
So we sort of find ourselves stuck in this materialistic, atheistic world. But yet your book ends with a lot of hope. So what gets us, where's the hope? Talk about the hope.
Yeah.
I mean, C.S. Lewis talks about, that we all have this thing in us, this longing for something more.
Right. Yeah. So that $1 million question, the 20th century tried to experiment in remaking man into a new image and kind of stamping out the old version of him, the metaphysical identity of man. But the question is, did it work? And I would say, no, it didn't work. That metaphysical identity always is going to be reborn. And Arendt talks about this, like, our hope is the new generation who's born, who isn't already ideologically possessed and can see reality again for what it is. And that metaphysical identity will return. And so, even if it's lost for a time, it'll come back. And that's why I ended with the quote from, Cardinal George here, which I think I had heard it many times, but I hadn't heard the last line for whatever reason until I looked it up. But he says, "I expect to die in bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history." And so, I think we can be hopeful. We can try to remake the human image, but honestly, I think it's always going to fail. Always going to fail. We're always going to come back to the same perennial questions of life. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going?
Young people have a tough time of it today, trying to, sort through everything that's out there. But I do see a lot of hope with young people. They always believe in love, for one thing, which is a very metaphysical thing.
For sure.
I'm always fascinated by people who say that it's, just a material world. And then I'll say, well, how do you explain love or friendships between people, or that deep desire that this world isn't enough, that that I don't want you to die. I love you. I don't want you to die. I've talked with people who, they are basically atheists, materialists, but then their mom or dad has died and they miss them and they want to see them again. And they have this deep longing for something that they don't believe in. It's very interesting.
Jose Ortega Gasset talks about that, like, behind the scientist, you always have a person, right? And a person desires these things that you're talking about. And so that's why I chose to write partially about him, is because I think the existentialist perspective is important today, starting from the perspective of me as a human in this world, okay, and my desires, like you said, for love, for ultimate fulfillment, for the afterlife, to continue to see my loved ones, and to kind of begin there as like an inroad to get them to consider some deeper concepts. I think, when society today is so antithetical to hearing just the truth straight up, beginning to engage people with beauty or through their desires might be a different way we can evangelize.
One of the things we've talked about in our book, Philosophy Begins in Wonder, which has a big section with metaphysics, is the concept of gratitude. And, obviously, if you give me a present, I can be grateful to you. Or, if my parents were good to me as a kid, which they were, I can be grateful to my parents. But what about those times where it's bigger than that? Like, I have good health. Well, I've taken care of myself, but I want to be grateful for, or I survive a car accident, or my child survives a car accident. And then you want to be grateful to what? You can't be grateful to a force in the universe. Like, if it's sort of a Star Wars impersonal force, you can't be grateful to a force, really. Not in the true sense of gratitude that you can have for a person. And so there becomes this deep desire of wanting to be grateful, to be thankful to something greater than myself, which again is that pointer to God as a personal being, not as a Star Wars force, but as a personal being that can receive my gratitude.
Right. Yeah, this idea that we're just, the dust from exploding stars who randomly came together through undirected blind processes, and that life is utterly meaningless, that just doesn't sit right with the human person. And some people might say, well, you just want these things to be true. But I think you can look at it deeper. It's like the idea of a phantom limb that I mentioned in here. Okay, why do I feel something or desire for something if there's nothing about me that is of that thing, right? Why do I feel hungry if I don't even have a stomach? That doesn't make any sense, right? Why do I long for a connection with God if it's impossible for God to exist? It doesn't, or meaning, or a grand narrative for my life. And because animals don't.
One of the ideas we talk about is, why are we so uncomfortable with time? Time either goes too slow or too fast. Very rarely are we just happy with time. We're very uncomfortable, but I don't think a fish is uncomfortable in water. I don't think he says, get me out. But we don't like change, and we don't like time. It's never quite right for us. And so again, that points to something where we could be outside of time, that we don't really belong in time. That we could get outside of it. And I talk to that with students a lot, and then that's a kind of a pointer to the eternal, that we're meant for something that isn't in time.
Right. And that longing in time ceases when you receive the good that you're meant for, because then there's nothing more to strive after, right? Then you can be content. But it seems like here on earth, we're always striving. I mean, you can set goals, but then you meet the goal and then you have to set another goal and so on and so forth. We never reach that contentment, like you said, that animals seem to have. I mean, animals don't have existential crises. They just exist and
feed the dog, pet the dog, and he's all set.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about the concept of materialism as a sort of a bad, sad story. And not that you want to believe the theistic story just to make yourself feel good. But it always fascinates me that people can pour themselves into such a dismal, bad story and want others to join them in that bad story.
Right.
And one of the things that has fascinated me with the materialism is John Paul II talks in, I think it's in Theology of the Body, he talks about pornography, which of course our kids are inundated with on the internet today. Right. And he says this fascinating thing, that pornography shows too little of the body. Because we think, oh, it shows too much of the body.
Right.
It shows too little of the body. And that's always been just brilliant to me, because it's not showing the big picture of what our body is, and that our soul shines through this body, and that your body is special because it's you, that you're not just a body, you're not just this material blob. And so something that shows me just your body without your soul connected to it shows too little. It doesn't show the beauty. It doesn't show me who you are as a person. And Dietrich von Hildebrand had a brilliant statement. You're familiar with him. The gentleman that I have written some of the books with, Stephen Schwartz. Dietrich von Hildebrand was his philosophy professor and his godfather. And he made the statement in a classroom. He pointed to a chair and he said, compared to the reality of a person, this chair doesn't even exist. Compared to the reality of a person, this chair doesn't even exist.
Right.
And you can kind of get that when you love somebody.
Right. Yeah.
So young people, I think the point where you can reach them is when they love things. Like you mentioned, beauty. They love music. They love hiking in the mountains. They've got, kids who go rock climbing. That beauty is a wonderful way to point people to the metaphysical world.
Right. And sometimes, people get stuck on the problem of suffering. But if you think about it, in a way, God often uses suffering to open our eyes to the deeper realities of life. Because when everything's going well and perfect, I'm not necessarily thinking about some of these higher things. But then once my life, I experience like a crisis of sorts or a tragedy, then I realize, wait a minute, I'm not in control. I could lose everything. Everything is fragile. So yeah, maybe I should think about this in a deeper way.
Peter Kreeft talked about how overall death does that for all of us, that we have this, it puts this frame around life that we, even if we're not immediately suffering, we know, we're not going to get out of this alive.
Well,
so it does force us to say, like, where am I going? Who am I? What am I? Those questions that you started the book with. What is this whole thing? What is it? Why is there something and not nothing?
Yeah, and that's what I found so interesting about the transhumanism part. And reading the excerpts from like the Transhumanist Manifesto, they honestly want to try to prevent death from happening. They want to use technology to keep us here forever, because if you don't believe in an afterlife, well, then why would you want to die? You just would want to continue this life as long as you could. Now, is that going to be possible? I mean, who knows? Probably not. But but that's their goal of, developing science and technology, is to try to make it so we don't have to even face death.
We'll wind up like that thing in That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, just a head attached to things.
Right.
You ever read that?
I haven't read that one, no.
We have to read that science trilogy. Yeah.
Well, they even talk about, what if we could jettison our bodies altogether and somehow get our consciousness into an artificial, computer or something like that.
Yeah. It's funny, friends and I, we've talked a lot about death, and, nobody wants to die today or, next week, or everyone would like to live a long, healthy life. But yet if you said to me, well, how would you like to live another 1,000,000 years? Like, even in the state you are now, healthy,
right,
but you could live for 1,000,000 years. It's like,
I don't think I'd want that.
Something horrible. There's somehow something horrible in that concept. Okay, another 20 years or 100 years. But if I start to think in the term of 1,000,000 years, I'll just do this over and over and over again for 1,000,000 years.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with that.
Yeah, it's like,
doesn't feel good.
Being like perpetually hungry and never sitting down for the meal that you've been desiring,
Right.
Just staying hungry forever. Yeah, there's something not right about that.
So all those things that they point to something beyond just the material world. And I do have a lot of hope that young people latch on to that.
Yeah, the other day I threw out this thought experiment, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but maybe not exactly. To my students, I said, all right, in the future, they've designed this machine where you could give up your regular life and you could attach to this machine, and it would pump you full of dopamine and whatever other, positive pleasure chemicals that you wanted endlessly. But you couldn't go back to your old life. But you could just enjoy as much pleasure as you wanted forever. Would you take it? And most of them said, oh my gosh, no, I would never want to do that. Because I think they can even intuit there's a hierarchy to these things. Like, pleasure feels good, but it's not the same thing as meaning, I think. Like, when we find meaning in something, or in helping somebody, or in loving someone, it doesn't always feel good, but they're not quite equivalent there.
Yeah, the example I've used with the teenagers is, would you, who wants to go to Six Flags this weekend? Yeah, you want to go. Who wants to live at Six Flags forever?
Right.
Like, oh, forever? Like, yeah, you just go in and you just never leave. You just ride the merry-go-round and the roller coaster day after day after day, and that's all you do. That's it.
Right.
And they start to realize, like, no, that's not enough.
At some point, that becomes torture, right?
Right.
It goes from fun to then torture.
Right. At some point, it becomes boring. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas love never becomes boring, or friendships don't become boring.
Yeah. You can never exhaust the depths of a human person, or for that matter, obviously the depths of God, a relationship with God that's always, it's unending. Yes.
So I haven't asked you all the questions that you mentioned. Methodological, my glasses on here. Naturalism, and a few other things. Is there anything, we're kind of running out of time, that you would like to talk about that's in the book that's important, that you feel like we haven't gotten to, that you want your readers to know about?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just making people aware that at the root of every belief system is exactly that, belief. And science itself is a tool. It doesn't come with its own set of values. Okay, even though today we make it seem like science can explain everything, if you look a little deeper, at the root is a worldview, and that's the methodological naturalism, that all that exists are matter, space, energy. But that's not something that's proven, right? That's an assumption. That's a belief of faith. And so, yeah, for Christians especially, I think it's hard not to be intimidated by sort of like the strength of science and technology. But then realizing, wait a minute, it's more the worldview of naturalism that's pushing against us. Science isn't bad, right? You can do science from an intelligent design perspective, for example. And so, yeah, not to be intimidated of learning about the world, and realizing that there's always a set of assumptions, at the basis of every person who's speaking.
So I loved the book. I just found it easy reading, which surprised me. When you were writing it, who do you want to buy it? Who was your intended audience when you were writing it?
I think anybody who's willing to think a little bit deeper. I truly believe that everybody can do philosophy, because whether you know it or not, you philosophize in your daily life. And so I wrote it, and my hope is to, with my blog too, to try to empower people. Hey, don't be intimidated to pick up Plato or something and just start reading, because, you can do philosophy. And so, yeah, anybody who's willing to put a little bit of effort to think deeply, and to have an opinion and to philosophize, I think they can get something from it.
Good. It's funny you say anybody can do philosophy, and I love that idea that, we have the book Philosophy Begins in Wonder, that everyone, has points of wonder, but then you can go deeper. You never quite know where it's going to take you.
Right.
25 years ago, my husband and I decided with a couple of other people that we wanted to read the Summa Theologica. We didn't know too much about it, but we decided that this group would meet once a month, tackle a question or two, and, in a couple of years, we'd finish it up. And it was 25 years ago, and we just finished it this month.
Holy cow. Congratulations. Oh my goodness.
And, 25 years of the Summa. But it was fun over, cheese and wine. And we've had people come and go in the group over the 25 years. But it's been a lot of fun, and philosophy is fun. And I think your book makes it fun, makes it easy to understand. You give some great ideas, some great things to chew on a little bit, and also to help people to question, what is my worldview? Where do my, what do I believe, and what kind of actions flow out of my beliefs? Pope Francis talks about people making shipwrecks of their lives. I love that, the shipwreck. And we don't want our young people to have their lives be a shipwreck.
Yeah.
But your worldview can determine that. If your worldview and your ideas don't correspond with truth and reality, then you do wind up with a shipwreck.
Right. And that's one of the biggest things, I think, if we want to push back against some of these bad ideologies, we have to empower people to be able to critically think for themselves and to analyze. And so, yeah, I think that's super important.
Yeah, it's tough in a culture like this. The kids have got a lot of work ahead of them. It's a tough culture.
Very
but
true.
I do think there are times where, it can it can show too many of its cards, so to speak. When kids start to realize, this isn't the world I want to live in. That's materialism. I want to have gratitude. I want to have friendships, love,
meaning.
Yeah,
purpose,
meaning, not just meaning in life, but meaning of life. That the whole thing has a meaning. We just sometimes between that. I have a lot of meaning in my life, but materialism can handle that to some extent. But having meaning of life, that the whole thing has a meaning, that it just doesn't end in, well, that was nice. I had a great life, and I had great kids and great grandkids. And now I'm going to die tomorrow, and that's it. It's all done for. I learned everything I learned for nothing.
And I would say, without that ultimate meaning, every other meaning is, in a way, kind of like a distraction. You're keeping yourself busy so that you don't end up thinking about the ultimate meaning.
Right. You have to keep yourself on the roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because if it isn't ultimately meaningful, it's very sad. I mean, if your friendships, you have a wonderful friendship or a wonderful marriage, or wonderful children, and you have this great love, and then it just ends. Like it's,
Right.
500 years from now, it just doesn't exist at all.
Right.
We sense that there's something terribly wrong with that.
Yeah.
that worldview.
Or the idea that we can reduce a human person and our relationship with them, and when they say "I love you," down to the movement of atoms and physical forces, it just something that doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's very. So we have this deep inner longing for something more than that. Yeah, and it's important to pay attention to that.
For sure. Yeah, I think, like you said, that's the beginning of philosophy, or it can be.
Begins in wonder.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm going to buy copies of the book for all my friends in our prayer group for Christmas, because I just think it's you answer so many questions in it. And I do a lot of philosophy, but I don't really do a lot of the history of philosophy. And so you helped put point A together with B, C, and D for me. And I found that really helpful. And I think people are going to love the book. So I highly recommend it. It just did a great job of making things that I knew were there, but you clarified a lot. So thank you. Great job.
Yeah,
great
thank
book.
you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Do you want to end us with prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, thank you for this time together. I pray, Father, for your blessing over this work. I pray that it might have a positive impact on people's lives and bring them closer to you. Amen.
Amen.
Father, Son,
Thank you.
and the Holy Spirit. All right, thank you so much, Kiki. It's great talking with you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay, bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.